June 4th, 1943, Norfolk Naval Base, Virginia. After 2 grinding weeks at sea, the ships slid into harbor and the exhausted German prisoners crowded the rails, bracing for jeers, rough hands, and shackles. Instead, they stared at something that didn't fit anything they'd been taught. Black and white dock workers hauling freight together, women in work overalls running heavy equipment, a brass band kicking out upbeat tunes, and the unmistakable smell of fresh coffee and warm donuts drifting across the pier. It was the first tiny fracture in their certainty about America. But what happened next hit even harder, and it changes the way you'll look at the war. Stick with us, and if you're into hidden Word 1 stories like this, don't forget to subscribe, drop a like, and support the channel so we can keep bringing these untold moments to light. June 4th, 1943, Norfolk Naval Base, Virginia. The air along the piers was heavy with diesel exhaust and salt spray, and the long complaining squeal of mooring lines echoed off steel hulls as the ships eased in. Then the gangways dropped. Out came the prisoners, thousands of them, sunburned, hollow-eyed, still wearing the dust of North Africa in their seams. Their boots rang on the pier with that sharp metallic clatter that makes every step feel louder than it should. Most of them were braced for the usual, curses, shoves, maybe a rifle butt for moving too slowly. Their minds had already written the scene. But the dock didn't match the script. Instead of a mob, there was work. Cranes swung in steady arcs, rigging clinked, forklifts rattled past. Longshoremen barked orders like it was any other day, not a moment in history. Somewhere nearby a radio crackled with the voice of a baseball announcer, and the sound, so casual, so normal, floated through the industrial noise like it belonged to a different planet. And then the details started landing. Black and white workers hoisting cargo side by side, women in coveralls moving with practiced confidence, running machines that looked too big for any one person. Sailors laughing at something in a newspaper. The place didn't feel panicked or fragile or divided. It felt organized, alive, routine. For men raised on speeches about American decay, the ordinariness was almost the most disturbing part. It wasn't propaganda painted onto a wall. It was a country acting like it expected to win, because it was already operating at full speed. And standing there on the pier, blinking into the Virginia sun, the prisoners realized something unsettling. This was only their first hour in America, and already the story they'd been fed was starting to fall apart. These men had been trained to believe America was weak, chaotic, and fatally divided. But before they'd even taken a full hour on U.S. soil, that story started to splinter. Right there, in plain view, black and white workers loading cargo side by side, moving with the kind of coordination you only get when a system actually works. Women in overalls operated cranes and heavy machinery like they'd been doing it for years. Not as a stunt, not as a photo op, just as part of the shift. And the prisoners couldn't stop watching. One later admitted they'd expected disorder, even collapse. Instead, the place ran with a calm, industrial rhythm. Whistles, shouted instructions, cranes swinging, pallets thudding into place, like a giant machine that never hesitated. The message didn't need to be spoken. Whatever America was, it wasn't the brittle, crumbling society Nazi propaganda had promised. That's why this moment mattered. It wasn't a lecture. It was an everyday scene that quietly demolished an ideology. For the first time, some of them had to consider an unbearable thought. If they lied about this, what else had they lied about? Norfolk wasn't just a harbor. It was a message, delivered without a single speech. As the prisoners were marched off the ship, the base unfolded around them like an industrial city that never slept. Piers stretching into the water, warehouses stacked like cliffs, dry docks big enough to swallow ships whole. The cranes alone felt unreal, steel giants swinging loads with effortless precision. For men who'd been told America was soft and disorganized, the scene didn't look decadent. It looked certain, like a country that didn't need to prove anything, because the proof was already moving, humming, and lifting right in front of them. And then came the part that gnawed at them. The guards weren't panicked. Rifles were there, yes, but carried with the loose confidence of men who didn't expect trouble. No chains, no dramatic show of domination. The prisoners weren't marched with their heads forced down. They were allowed to look, to stare at the port, the trains, the endless flow of cargo. They weren't shielded from factories or infrastructure, as if the Americans had decided, go ahead, see it, count it. That was the paradox that hit hardest. In the Reich, an enemy would never be shown anything important. You hide your output, disguise your routes, keep prisoners blind. Here, the U.S. seemed to do the opposite. Not secrecy, but visibility. Not fear, but confidence. And in that confidence was a quiet kind of pressure. Because once a prisoner realizes his enemy isn't trying to impress him, isn't even trying to intimidate him, but is simply living and working at a scale that feels impossible, the propaganda starts to collapse under its own weight. Norfolk didn't have to threaten them. It just had to exist. The trains waited just beyond the piers, shining in the Virginia sun, and the prisoners blinked when they saw them. Not boxcars, not cattle trucks, passenger coaches. In Europe, transport meant cramped wooden wagons, bodies pressed together, air thick with sweat and fear. Here there were windows, seats, space to breathe. A guard waved them forward with almost casual impatience, as if this were routine paperwork instead of the movement of enemy soldiers across a continent. And then the train rolled out, not by some secret back route, not under a cover of darkness, but straight through towns and farmland like the prisoners weren't even worth hiding. Through the open windows, America flashed by in scenes so ordinary they felt unreal. Men mowing lawns, kids with ice cream cones, couples strolling down sidewalks like the world hadn't been set on fire overseas. At stations, civilians stood on the platforms and simply watched. Curious faces, a few raised hands, some even waved. No shouting, no spitting, no rage. That absence of hatred landed like a blow. One prisoner later wrote that it felt as if they were invisible, not because Americans didn't notice them, but because Americans didn't fear them. The country wasn't acting like a nation under siege. It was acting like a nation that could afford to keep moving, keep living, and still win the war. And with every mile inland, the message sharpened. This wasn't the America they'd been taught to expect. Once the train started moving, the real punch wasn't a single dramatic moment. It was the relentless accumulation of proof, mile after mile, that America had more than the prisoner's worldview could explain. At the stations, the contrasts came fast. In dining counters and station cafes, civilians ate meals that looked almost obscene to men used to rationed black bread and thin soup, thick hamburgers, bright slices of tomato and onion, coffee that seemed to never run out. And then the small detail that stuck like a splinter in the mind. A porter taking a bite from an apple and tossing the rest away as if food were too common to matter. For men who'd watched comrades go hungry, it didn't read as waste, it read as surplus. Outside the windows, the landscape kept making the same argument. Freight yards packed with cars, long trains hauling coal, grain, steel, farms stretching wider than anything most of them had ever seen, wide fields, tall silos, water towers, and roads busy with trucks that looked brand new. Factories belched smoke, but not the desperate smoke of a nation scraping by, the steady output of a system running at full capacity. And then the Americans did something that felt almost deliberate. The route passed close enough to major plants that the prisoners could actually see production. Aircraft sections, fuselages, rows of machines at different stages of completion. They weren't being rushed past in darkness. They weren't shielded behind curtains. It was as if the country had decided to let the enemy look straight at the engine room. That visibility became its own kind of pressure. In Germany, prisoners were kept away from civilians, away from cities, away from anything that might reveal weakness or strength. Here, the opposite was true. The prisoners were moved in plain sight, through ordinary towns, past ordinary people, alongside the obvious machinery of a giant economy. Civilians didn't panic. They didn't riot. Most just watched, puzzled, curious, and occasionally disarmingly calm. For the prisoners, it created a humiliating kind of awe, not because anyone taunted them, but because no one seemed to need to. And that's the key beat of this section. America wasn't trying to intimidate them with threats. It was overwhelming them with normal life plus massive output, shown openly. A quiet demonstration that said, without saying it, if we can live like this during war, imagine what we can do to win it. When the trains finally stopped and the gates came into view, a lot of the prisoners felt their bodies tighten the same way they had under artillery. This is where the real punishment starts. In their minds, captivity meant what they'd seen in war and heard in stories: cold floors, dirty straw, sickness that spread unchecked, wounds left to rot because medicine was for your own side. But the first thing they ran into wasn't brutality, it was order. Doctors were waiting. Nurses had clipboards. Men were checked, sorted, treated, like the camp was a machine with a medical wing, not a dungeon. The air smelled sharp and clean, the way antiseptic stings your nose. There were real bandages, real clinics, real beds with clean sheets. And then they saw the stacks. Red Cross parcels piled neatly like supplies in a warehouse. Boxes that felt almost unreal to men who'd lived on scarcity. The contents weren't just calories, they were comfort. Chocolate, tinned meat, cigarettes, soap. Things that didn't belong in the imagination of someone who expected revenge. Even special diets showed up in quiet, practical ways. Labels, separate rations, accommodations that signaled a strange message. You're the enemy, but you're still a human being. The biggest shock, though, came in a syringe. Penicillin, modern, effective, life-saving, used on them. Not reluctantly, not as a bargaining chip, just administered, the way you'd treat any patient who might die without it. For men who'd watched infections turn minor wounds into funerals, It felt like the world had flipped upside down. Some German doctors in captivity were even allowed to work under supervision, treating their own comrades alongside American staff. Not as a favor to Nazis, but as a professional reality. Medicine was medicine. White coats didn't erase the war, but inside those wards, it blurred the lines in a way propaganda never prepared them for. That's the point of this section. The camp didn't begin by breaking them. It began by healing them. And once you've been cared for by the enemy, fed, cleaned, treated like you might matter, something dangerous happens to an ideology built on hate. It starts to crack from the inside. When the gates of Camp Hearn, Texas finally swung open, the prisoners expected the usual image of captivity: mud, misery, and a life designed to grind them down. What they stepped into looked almost like a small, orderly town. Rows of pale barracks sat on wide, straight lanes. There was a hospital wing. There were work areas and recreation fields. And inside the buildings, this was the first jolt, there was electric light. Ceiling fans turned in the heavy air. Switches worked. For men from villages where power could be scarce even before the war, the idea that they had more modern comfort as prisoners than some did at home felt like a prank that refused to reveal itself. Then came the daily rhythm that made the disbelief worse. Meals weren't just edible. They were regular, structured, posted. Men who had lived on thin rations found themselves eating until full, day after day. Eggs, potatoes, meat, coffee, bread that wasn't dark and sour. The shock wasn't only hunger being satisfied. It was the realization that this was policy, planned, measured, maintained, like the camp was run on schedules and standards, not impulse and spite. And the camp store, another contradiction. Instead of pure deprivation, there was choice. Prisoners were issued camp script they could spend on basics and small comforts: soap, writing paper, cigarettes, snacks. It wasn't freedom, but it was something close to agency, and that tiny sliver of control hit harder than any insult ever could. But the moment that truly rewired the way many of them felt came with a ritual, not a rule. Christmas Eve. Local families donated decorations. A huge tree went up. The mess hall filled with music. And the prisoners, men who had been taught that the enemy would mock their faith and erase their traditions, found guards who didn't stop the celebration and, in some cases, joined it. Carols in the same room as watchtowers. Familiar hymns floating over a place that was supposed to feel like punishment. One prisoner later said he cried, not because he was weak, but because the scene made a brutal comparison unavoidable. The enemy was willing to honor a holy night with captives, while back home the war machine demanded only more sacrifice. That's why Camp Hearn is such a turning point in the story. It wasn't that the camp was nice. It's that it was so normal, so organized, and sometimes so unexpectedly human that it attacked the prisoners' certainty at the deepest level. If the Americans were the monsters they'd been warned about, why did captivity feel like this? When the Germans first got assigned to labor details outside the wire, most of them expected it to be humiliation with a rifle pointed at their backs, hard work, harsh treatment, and zero dignity. Instead, they were loaded onto trucks and driven into a different kind of shock: scale. Fields of cotton, corn, peanuts, and wheat ran so far they looked like they never ended. Tractors and equipment were bigger than anything many of them had seen at home. The work was real, hot, gritty, exhausting, but it wasn't framed as punishment. It was framed as a job. They were organized into crews, given tasks, and, this part mattered, they were paid in camp script they could use at the canteen. That changed everything about how it felt. Farmers who were wary at first often settled into a blunt, practical rhythm. You work, you drink water, you get through the day. And then the human moments started happening in the cracks between rows and fence lines. A jug of iced tea brought out without a word. A watermelon cut open in the shade. Sandwiches handed over like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. For prisoners raised on the idea that Americans were soulless and cruel, that ordinary kindness was disorienting. And it wasn't just farms. Work crews ended up in mills, timber operations, road jobs, seeing firsthand how much the country produced and how casually it moved goods around. After shifts, some were driven through small towns where store windows were bright and shelves looked full. Kids rode bikes, diners glowed with neon. Life looked uninterrupted. Then there were the encounters that stuck longest because they were so small. A prisoner helping a farmer's daughter with homework. Someone asking about Germany, not to mock, just to understand. Music drifting out of a barn or a porch while Americans listened to Germans play. Moments where the enemy stopped being a label and became a person standing 5 feet away. That's the heart of this section. Outside labor didn't just fill a wartime manpower gap. For many prisoners, it became a slow, unavoidable education about abundance, yes, but more than that, about a society confident enough to let its enemies work in its fields and still treat them in countless little ways like human beings. And each of those little moments did what lectures and threats couldn't. It made the propaganda harder to believe. Behind the barbed wire, the camps didn't stay just camps for long. For a lot of the German prisoners, captivity turned into something they never expected. A place where their minds were kept busy, their culture wasn't stamped out, and their beliefs started to unravel in slow, steady ways. Classes appeared first, makeshift camp universities run by the prisoners themselves. Chalk on boards, borrowed textbooks, lessons in math, engineering, English, history, philosophy. Men who'd spent years being told what to think suddenly had hours to read, argue, and ask questions out loud. In the evenings, barracks that should have been silent filled with debate instead. Then came the art. With scrap wood and leftover paint, they built stages. They put on plays and concerts. They formed choirs and orchestras. They sketched portraits, carved small figures, painted landscapes of the very country that held them. The strange part wasn't that they created, it was that they were allowed to. In Europe, war was flattening theaters and shattering concert halls. Here, inside a prison camp, culture was being rebuilt from whatever materials could be found. Even religion, something the prisoners expected to be restricted, was often handled with a kind of blunt respect. Services were held, hymns carried into the warm air. Holiday traditions weren't automatically treated as suspicious or forbidden. And when Christmas came around, the most unsettling moments weren't about fences or guards. They were about familiar songs being sung in an unfamiliar place, sometimes close enough that the men watching from towers could hear every word. But the real turning point, again and again, wasn't a policy or a program. It was people. The farmer who spoke to them like workers, not monsters. The family that offered a meal. The kid who stared, then waved. The small kindnesses that didn't fit the story they'd been trained to believe. Those moments didn't convert anyone overnight, but they did something more dangerous to propaganda. They made certainty impossible. And over time, that's what this whole arc becomes. Not just prisoners being held, but prisoners becoming witnesses. witnesses to a society that had flaws and contradictions, sure, but also confidence, productivity, and a kind of everyday humanity that their leaders had insisted didn't exist. So, by the end, the transformation isn't really about liking America. It's about the collapse of the old narrative. Because once you've seen the enemy living openly, feeding you, paying you, treating your wounds, letting you study and create, one thought keeps returning, sharper every day. If they lied about America being weak and cruel, what else was a lie? And that's why, for some of these men, the war didn't end with surrender. It ended with a realization. The most powerful thing they encountered wasn't a bomb or a battleship. It was the shock of being treated like a human being by the side they were taught to hate.
That's ends of the untold stories of the German POWs arriving in Norfolk and the Nazi propaganda falling apart. Thank you for watching. Please consider subscribing to the channel.